Steve Harvey destroyed a racist player who said black families don't belong here, and the way it happened will shock you. This is the story of how one man's toxic words became the biggest mistake of his life, how his carefully built reputation crumbled in seconds, and how Steve Harvey made sure that silence and racism would never be tolerated again. Watch what happens when power meets accountability. The ballroom was pristine. Crystal chandeliers hung from cathedral ceilings like frozen diamonds, casting golden light across marble floors that reflected every movement like a mirror to perfection. This wasn't just any venue, this was the venue. The kind of place where old money mixed with new influence, where power brokers made deals that shaped industries, and where the elite gathered to celebrate themselves and their untouchable status. It was a charity gala. The irony would later become impossible to ignore. Steve Harvey stood near the entrance, surveying the room with the kind of awareness that comes from decades of reading people. He'd been invited as a guest of Honora Man, who built an empire from nothing, who climbed higher than anyone in that room ever thought possible. But he wasn't here to bask in the spotlight tonight. He was here to observe, to connect, to be present. That S, when he first noticed them. A black family, parents, 2 children, dressed impeccably, stood near one of the cocktail tables. They looked uncomfortable, not in the way people look when they out of place, but in the way people look when they being made to feel unwelcome. Their smiles were tight, their body language was closed off. They kept glancing at each other as if silently asking, "Are we supposed to be here?" Steve's instincts fired immediately. He spent his entire life reading these signals. He knew what exclusion looked like. He knew what it felt like to be the only black face in a room full of white privilege. But this was 2024. This was supposed to be different. Then he heard it. The voice came from across the room, loud, confident, dripping with entitlement. It belonged to Marcus Wellington, a professional athlete whose name had been synonymous with excellence for 15 years. 6'4", perfectly groomed, wearing a custom suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. He was surrounded by his usual circle-eyed men, hangers-on, people who laughed at his jokes and validated his every opinion. "I mean, seriously," Marcus was saying, his voice carrying across the ballroom with a kind of volume that suggested he didn't care who heard him. "This is supposed to be an exclusive event, for people who actually belong here. And yet, here we are, letting just anyone walk through the doors." His friends laughed, the kind of hollow, performative laughter that exists only to reinforce social hierarchy. But Marcus wasn't done. "Black families?" he continued, his tone dripping with contempt. "At a place like this, come on. This is supposed to maintain a certain standard, a certain level of sophistication, you know what I mean?" The room didn't go silent, not immediately. Some people pretended not to hear. Others exchanged uncomfortable glances. A few of his friends laughed harder, desperate to stay in his good graces. But there was a shift in the energy, a crack in the facade of civility that everyone in that room had carefully maintained. Steve Harvey felt it before anything else, that heat that rises in your chest when you witness injustice so blatant, so unapologetic, that it demands a response. His jaw tightened, his hands clenched slightly. Every muscle in his body tensed with the weight of a decision he was about to make. He looked back at the black family. The father's face had hardened. The mother's eyes had filled with something between hurt and rage. The children, they were old enough to understand that something wrong had just happened, even if they didn't fully understand the words. They could feel the rejection. They could feel the message. "You don't belong here." This was the moment. Steve Harvey had spent his entire career building bridges, uplifting people, creating spaces where everyone felt valued. He turned his pain into purpose, his struggles into strength. He built an empire on the principle that everyone deserves dignity, respect, and a seat at the table. And he was looking at a man who embodied everything he spent his life fighting against. Marcus Wellington stood there, completely unaware that his words had just set something in motion. He had no idea that the most powerful man in that room, a man who controlled media, influence, and the narratives that shaped culture, had just witnessed his racism firsthand. He had no idea that his arrogance had just met its match. Steve took a breath. A long, deliberate breath that seemed to contain years of patience finally reaching its breaking point. He began walking toward Marcus Wellington. The crowd noticed immediately. Conversations died mid-sentence. People turned to watch. There was an electricity in the air now, kind that precedes something significant. Everyone could feel it. Everyone knew that something was about to happen. Marcus saw Steve approaching, and his face lit up with a smile, of the kind of smile you give when you think you were about to be validated by someone important. He had no idea what was coming. "Steve, my man," Marcus called out, extending his hand for a handshake. "Great to see you here. We were just talking about," but Steve Harvey didn't shake his hand. Instead, he looked Marcus directly in the eyes. And in that moment, something shifted. The smile on Marcus's face began to falter. He could see something in Steve's expression, not anger exactly, but something far more dangerous. Disappointment, conviction, the kind of look that comes from someone who has decided that enough is enough. "We need to talk," Steve said quietly. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of a thunderstorm building on the horizon. "Right now. About what you just said." Marcus's confidence wavered for just a second, but it was enough. He glanced at his friends, as if looking for support, for validation that this was no big deal. But they were already backing away. They could sense what was coming. "I don't know what you were talking about," Marcus said, trying to regain his footing. But his voice had lost its edge. It had lost its certainty. "Oh, you know exactly what I'm talking about," Steve replied, his voice still quiet, still controlled, but now carrying an unmistakable edge. "And everyone in this room knows what you were talking about, too." Steve Harvey looked around the ballroom. Hundreds of eyes were now fixed on this moment. The black family that Marcus had insulted was watching. The staff members, many of them black, were watching. The other guests were watching. The entire room had become an audience to what was about to unfold, and Steve Harvey was about to give them a show they would never forget. But Marcus Wellington still didn't realize the magnitude of what he just triggered. He still thought he could talk his way out of this. He still believed that his status, his money, his position in the world would protect him. He was about to learn the most painful lesson of his life. What he didn't know was that Steve Harvey had just decided to make him an example, not out of anger, but out of principle. And when Steve Harvey makes that decision, there's nowhere left to hide. Marcus Wellington. Hadn't he always been this way? Or rather, he had always been this way, but he'd learned to hide it better. His rise to prominence had been meteoric. Drafted straight out of college at 22 years old, he'd immediately become a star. The kind of athlete that networks fought over, that sponsors lined up to pay millions of dollars, that fans worshipped like a god. Within 5 years, he was a household name. Within 10, he was a legend. But legends, it turned out, came with a particular kind of power, the kind that corrupted absolutely. Marcus grew up in a wealthy suburb, the kind of place where diversity meant having a few token minorities at your country club. His parents were successful, influential, and completely insulated from the real world. They taught him early that he was special, that he was destined for greatness, that the rules that applied to ordinary people simply didn't apply to him. When he became an athlete, that lesson was reinforced 1,000 times over. Coaches overlooked his behavioral issues because he could throw a ball better than anyone else. Schools bent their rules for him. The legal system treated him with kid gloves. Women threw themselves at him. Men wanted to be him. The world had constructed an entire infrastructure designed to tell Marcus Wellington that he was untouchable. And he believed it. Over the years, his racism had evolved from casual comments at dinner parties to something far more systemic. He didn't just hold prejudiced views, she actively worked to maintain systems that benefited him and people like him while excluding everyone else. He made jokes about black people. He made comments about how certain neighborhoods were declining. He questioned the qualifications of black colleagues and competitors, always suggesting they'd gotten where they were through affirmative action rather than merit. But here's what was crucial. He'd never been held accountable for any of it. His team's management had quietly asked him to be more careful with his public statements, not because they disagreed with him, but because they worried about the optics. His friends laughed at his comments and reinforced them. His family validated his worldview. The media, desperate for access and ratings, gave him a platform and rarely challenged him. The system had built walls around Marcus Wellington, walls made of money, influence, and complicity. Within those walls, he'd become increasingly bold. His comments had become less veiled, more direct. He'd started making statements that would have ended careers for ordinary people. But Marcus wasn't ordinary. Marcus was protected. Just 6 months before this gala, he'd made a comment on a podcast about the problem with diversity hiring that should have sparked outrage. Instead, it had sparked a brief news cycle that disappeared within days. A few think pieces on Twitter, a couple of op-eds, then silence. The machine had absorbed his words and moved on. That's what power looked like in America. The ability to say the quiet part out loud and still face no real consequences. Marcus had learned the lesson well. He'd learned that as long as he was valuable enough, as long as he could still throw a ball, still draw ratings, still sell tickets, he could say almost anything. He'd learned that racism wasn't really punished in this country if you had enough money and status. He'd learned that the system would protect him, again and again, no matter what came out of his mouth. So he'd become comfortable, complacent, arrogant in a way that only comes from years of facing zero accountability. This gala was perfect for him. It was full of people like him, wealthy, powerful, disconnected from the real world. People who made racist comments at dinner parties and then went home to their gated communities without a second thought. People who believed that certain spaces should remain exclusive code for white. Marcus had arrived that evening feeling invincible. He'd walked into the ballroom like he owned it. He'd greeted the other wealthy guests with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing you among your people. He'd made his racist comment about the black family without hesitation, without fear, without any sense that this might be the moment everything changed. Because in his entire life, nothing had ever changed. He'd never faced real consequences. He'd never been held accountable. He'd never had to actually answer for his racism in any meaningful way. The system had trained him to believe he never would. But what Marcus didn't understand, what he couldn't possibly understand from his position of privilege, was that he'd just made a critical miscalculation. He'd assumed that everyone in that room operated under the same rules as him. He'd assumed that wealth and status were the ultimate currency, that they could buy silence, buy loyalty, buy forgiveness. He'd assumed that the people around him would continue to enable him, to laugh at his jokes, to validate his worldview. He'd assumed, in short, that he was untouchable. What he didn't know was that there was someone in that room who had built an entire career on the principle that nobody was untouchable. Someone who had spent decades dismantling the exact kind of systems that protected people like Marcus Wellington. Someone who understood, on a cellular level, what it meant to be excluded, to be underestimated, to be told you didn't belong. Steve Harvey had walked into that ballroom with a different kind of power than Marcus possessed. Marcus's power came from the system, from centuries of structures designed to elevate white men and diminish everyone else. It was power that depended on silence, on complicity, on the willingness of others to accept injustice as normal. Steve's power came from something else entirely. It came from having built something from nothing. It came from having overcome obstacles that would have broken most people. It came from having earned the respect and admiration of millions of people across the world. It came from having a platform, a voice, and the moral authority to use both. Most importantly, it came from having absolutely nothing to lose by speaking the truth. Marcus Wellington had spent his entire life in a bubble where racism was acceptable, where exclusion was normal, where the rules didn't apply to him. He'd never had to face anyone with the power and the will to burst that bubble, until tonight. Steve Harvey represented something that terrified people like Marcus on a fundamental level: accountability. Real, unavoidable, public accountability. The kind that couldn't be bought off, Couldn't he be explained away? Couldn't he be hidden from by retreating into your circle of enablers? Marcus had no idea what was about to hit him. He had no idea that his years of racism, his decades of exclusion, his lifetime of arrogance were about to be laid bare in front of hundreds of witnesses. He had no idea that the system that had protected him for so long was about to fail him completely. He had no idea that he was about to become an example not because Steve Harvey was cruel, but because Steve Harvey understood something fundamental. Sometimes, the only way to change a system is to make the consequences of participating in that system impossible to ignore. As Steve Harvey began walking toward him, Marcus Wellington was still smiling, still confident, still believing that his status would protect him. He was about to learn the hardest lesson of his privileged life, that there were consequences after all, that silence was no longer an option, that his reign of impunity was about to come to an abrupt and very public end. And the most terrifying part for Marcus? He had no idea how it was going to happen. The silence that followed Steve Harvey's words was deafening. Marcus Wellington stood frozen, his hand still extended in the air, a gesture of greeting that had become a gesture of rejection. His brain was struggling to process what had just happened. Steve Harvey, one of the most powerful men in entertainment, had just publicly called him out, in front of hundreds of people, at an exclusive charity gala. This wasn't supposed to happen. "I don't know what you mean," Marcus repeated, but his voice had lost all conviction. He was trying to play it cool, trying to act like this was no big deal, but everyone in the room could see the crack forming in his facade. Steve Harvey stepped closer, not aggressively, but with a deliberate, measured intensity that made the space between them feel charged with electricity. "You just told this room that a black family doesn't belong here," Steve said, his voice low enough that only Marcus and those immediately around them could hear, but loud enough that the silence allowed his words to carry across the entire ballroom. "You used the word standard, you used the word sophistication, and we both know what you meant." Marcus's jaw clenched. He glanced at his friends, expecting them to step in, to defend him, to create some kind of distraction. But they already melted away into the crowd. They could sense what was happening. They understood that this was no longer a situation where loyalty would be rewarded. This was a situation where proximity to Marcus Wellington was becoming dangerous. He was alone. "Look," Marcus said, his tone shifting to something that resembled damage control. "If anyone was offended, that wasn't my intention." "I was just making a joke about stop," Steve interrupted, holding up his hand. "Don't insult my intelligence. Don't insult this room's intelligence. We all heard what you said, we all know what you meant, and we all know that this isn't the first time." The words landed like a physical blow. Steve had just done something crucial. He expanded the scope of this confrontation beyond a single comment. He made it about a pattern, about a history, about systemic behavior that had been allowed to continue unchecked for far too long. Marcus's face went pale. "I'm not going to stand here and listen to," he started, turning away as if to leave. But Steve moved with him, not blocking his path, but making it clear that walking away wouldn't end this conversation. More importantly, Steve's next words stopped Marcus dead in his tracks. "6 months ago, you went on a podcast and said that diversity hiring was lowering standards," Steve said, his voice carrying across the room now. People were leaning in, phones were coming out, though Steve hadn't explicitly invited this. He clearly didn't care if it was being recorded. "You said that certain communities had a cultural problem with education. You've made comments about black women in your industry not being serious athletes. You've questioned the qualifications of every black colleague who's ever worked alongside you." With each statement, Marcus's face got redder. With each statement, more people in the room turned to watch. With each statement, the power dynamic shifted further and further away from Marcus Wellington. "And every single time," Steve continued, "you have been protected. By your team, by your friends, by a system that decided that your talent was worth more than your humanity, that your ability to throw a ball was worth more than basic human decency." Marcus tried to respond, but Steve wasn't finished. "But here's what you didn't understand," Steve said, and now his voice carried something that went beyond anger. It carried the weight of someone who had spent his entire life fighting against exactly this kind of system. Power isn't just about money. Power isn't just about status. Real power is about influence, about platform, about the ability to shape narratives and change culture. Steve paused, letting that sink in. "And I have that power, and I'm not going to waste it protecting racism." The room erupted not in chaos, but in a kind of shocked recognition. People were talking now, whispering. Their phones, definitely. Recording. This moment was already becoming history. This moment was already being transmitted to the outside world. Marcus Wellington's face had gone from red to white. He was starting to understand the magnitude of what was happening. This wasn't just a confrontation at a party. This was a public reckoning. This was his carefully constructed image beginning to crumble in real time. "You can Marcus started, but his voice had lost all authority. "Watch me," Steve said simply, and then he turned to face the room. This was the crucial moment. This was when Steve Harvey transformed from a man defending one black family into something far more significant. He transformed into a voice for everyone who had ever been excluded, diminished, or made to feel unwelcome by people like Marcus Wellington. "I want to be very clear about something," Steve said, addressing the entire ballroom now. His voice was calm, measured, but it commanded absolute attention. "What we witnessed tonight isn't an isolated incident. It's not one bad comment from one bad person. It's a symptom of a much larger disease that runs through our society." He gestured toward the black family that had been insulted. "This family came here tonight in good faith. They came here to support a charity that's supposed to be about helping people. And they were made to feel unwelcome. They were made to feel like they didn't belong. And why? Because of the color of their skin. Because someone decided that exclusivity meant excluding people who look like them." Steve paused, letting his eyes sweep across the room. "And I want to ask everyone here a question," he continued. "How many of you have done this? How many of you have made comments like this in your homes, in your offices, at your dinner parties? How many of you have laughed at jokes like this? How many of you have stayed silent when you heard something like this?" The room was completely still now. People were uncomfortable. They were being forced to confront their own complicity. They were being forced to ask themselves difficult questions about their own behavior. "Because silence is complicity," Steve said, and these words seemed to echo through the ballroom. "When you hear racism and you say nothing, you re-choosing a side. You re-choosing to protect the racist. You re-choosing to protect the system that allows racism to flourish." He turned back to Marcus. "And as for you," Steve said, "you need to understand something. Your career isn't over because of what I'm about to do. Your career is over because of what you've already done. I'm just making sure that the consequences finally catch up with you." Marcus opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was realizing, with a kind of dawning horror, that this was real, that his protection was gone, that the system that had enabled him for so long was no longer going to shield him from accountability. "Starting tomorrow," Steve continued, "I'm going to be releasing a statement detailing every racist comment you've made, every time you've excluded people based on their race, every instance where you've used your platform to spread prejudice. I'm going to be sharing it with every network, every sponsor, every organization that is currently benefiting from your name." Marcus's face went ashen. "And I'm going to be asking them a simple question. Do you want to continue doing business with someone who holds these values? Do you want your brand associated with racism? Do you want to be complicit in this?" Steve paused, and in that pause, you could feel the weight of what was about to happen. You could feel the seismic shift that was occurring, because, unlike you, Marcus, I'm not going to stay silent. Unlike the people who've enabled you for years, I'm not going to look the other way. And unlike the system that protected you, I'm going to make sure that there are actual consequences for your actions. Steve turned to address the room one final time. "This is what accountability looks like," he said. "This is what happens when power is used not to protect the powerful, but to protect the powerless. This is what happens when someone decides that silence is no longer an option." And with that, Steve Harvey walked away from Marcus Wellington, leaving him standing alone in the middle of the ballroom, exposed, vulnerable, and finally facing the consequences of his actions. The black family that had been insulted watched with tears streaming down their faces. Not tears of sadness, but tears of validation. Tears that said, "We see you. We believe you. You belong here." And Marcus Wellington stood in the center of that room, surrounded by hundreds of people, and felt something he'd never felt before in his entire privileged life. He felt alone. He felt exposed. He felt afraid. And he had no idea how much worse it was about to get. By the time Marcus Wellington left the ballroom that night, his phone was already exploding. The first text came from his agent at 11:47 p.m. "We need to talk. Now." The second came from his team's general manager at 11:52 p.m. "What the hell is happening? My phone won't stop ringing." By midnight, his publicist had sent 17 messages, each one more panicked than the last. By 12:30 a.m., his lawyer was calling. By 10:00 a.m., his wife had packed a bag and left their house. But the real damage was happening on the internet. Within minutes of Steve Harvey's confrontation, videos had started circulating on social media, not just clips of the confrontation itself, but compilations. Someone had dug up every racist comment Marcus had ever met at a podcast interview, the old interviews, the comments caught on hot mics during games. It was all there, assembled into a devastating timeline of racism that stretched back over a decade. The hashtag started trending within an hour. Hashtag Marcus Wellington racist. Hashtag accountability. Now, hashtag silences complicity. By 2 a.m., he had 500,000 new mentions on Twitter. By 3 a.m., it was over 1 million. The think pieces started appearing almost immediately. Sports journalists who'd been too afraid to call out his racism when it might have cost them access suddenly found their courage. They wrote about the pattern of his comments. They interviewed people who'd been hurt by his words. They detailed how the system had protected him, how networks had looked the other way, how sponsors had prioritized profit over principle. One article, published by a major sports outlet at 2:47 a.m., was titled, "The Marcus Wellington Reckoning: How One Man's Racism Exposed an Industry's Complicity." It went viral within minutes. By the time Marcus woke up on the morning after the gala, his world had fundamentally changed. His team had already issued a statement. "We are aware of the allegations regarding Marcus Wellington's past comments. We take these matters very seriously and are conducting a full investigation." Translation: "We are distancing ourselves from you as quickly as possible." His primary sponsor, a major athletic apparel company, had issued their own statement by 6 a.m. "We do not condone racism in any form. We are immediately suspending our partnership with Marcus Wellington, pending a full review of the allegations." Translation: "You were fired." By noon, 3 more sponsors had followed suit. By evening, 5 more. Each statement was carefully worded to protect the company's image, while throwing Marcus under the bus as quickly as possible. Each one was another nail in the coffin of his career. But the financial consequences were just the beginning. The real damage was happening in the court of public opinion. People who'd worked with Marcus over the years were coming forward. A black assistant coach who'd been passed over for promotions spoke about how Marcus had openly questioned his qualifications. A black female reporter who'd interviewed him years ago detailed how he'd made comments about her appearance and suggested she'd only gotten her job because of affirmative action. Former teammates, both black and white, were sharing stories about his behavior in locker rooms, at team events, in private conversations. The picture that emerged was damning. Marcus Wellington wasn't just casually racist. He was systematically, deliberately racist. He used his position of power to exclude, demean, and diminish black people at every opportunity. He weaponized his status to make sure that people who challenged him or tried to hold him accountable were silenced or pushed out. And for years, nobody had done anything about it. The question that kept appearing in articles, in social media posts, in conversations across the country was simple. Why had it taken Steve Harvey to finally hold him accountable? Why had the system allowed this to continue for so long? The answer was uncomfortable for a lot of people, because it required them to confront their own complicity. On the third day after the gala, Marcus's team officially suspended him. Indefinitely. The statement was brief, effective immediately. Marcus Wellington is suspended from all team activities pending the completion of our investigation into allegations of discriminatory conduct. Translation: your career with us is over. We were just waiting for the legal dust to settle before we make it official. By the end of that week, every major sponsor had dropped him. Every endorsement deal had been terminated. Every appearance had been canceled. The speaking engagements that had been scheduled for the next year, gone. The book deal that was supposedly in the works, pulled by the publisher. The infrastructure of his celebrity was collapsing in real time. But worse than the financial consequences was the social consequence. Marcus couldn't go anywhere without being recognized, without being confronted. He went to a coffee shop and the barista refused to serve him. He tried to go to his gym and was asked to leave. He attempted to take his family to dinner and was recognized by other diners, who made their displeasure known loudly enough that the restaurant asked him to leave. He'd become toxic, radioactive, the kind of person that other people didn't want to be associated with, not because of legal consequences, but because of social ones. Because being near him now meant being complicit in his racism. This was the power of accountability. Not punishment from above, but rejection from below. Not legal consequences, but social ones. The kind of consequences that money couldn't buy your way out of, that lawyers couldn't argue away, that publicists couldn't spin into something more palatable. Steve Harvey, meanwhile, had kept his promise. 2 days after the gala, he released a comprehensive statement detailing every racist comment Marcus had made, every instance of discrimination, every time he used his platform to spread prejudice. He included receipts, video clips, audio recordings, testimony from witnesses. He laid it all out with surgical precision, leaving no room for denial or reinterpretation. And then he did something even more significant. He used his platform to amplify the voices of the people who'd been hurt by Marcus's racism. He gave them a stage. He made sure their stories were heard. He transformed this from a single confrontation at a gala into a larger conversation about racism, accountability, and the systems that enable racist behavior. In interviews, Steve was measured but firm. He didn't celebrate Marcus's downfall. Instead, he used it as a teaching moment. He talked about how racism isn't just about individual bad actors, it's about systems that protect those bad actors. He talked about the responsibility that comes with power and platform. He talked about what real accountability looks like. This isn't about destroying Marcus Wellington, Steve said in one interview. This is about making sure that the next person who thinks they can be racist without consequences understands that times have changed. This is about creating a culture where silence is no longer an option. This is about accountability. The interview went viral. People who'd been skeptical of Steve's approach began to understand what he was actually doing. He wasn't being vindictive, he was being strategic. He was using this moment to shift the culture, to change the conversation, to make it clear that racism would no longer be tolerated or protected. By the end of the second week, Marcus Wellington had become a cautionary tale. His name was synonymous with racism. His face appeared in articles about accountability. His story was being taught in schools as an example of what happens when power is finally held accountable. His downfall had become a cultural momentum moment when the system that had protected powerful racist men finally failed them. He'd gone from being untouchable to being completely isolated. His wife had filed for divorce. His children were being bullied at school. His family had asked him to stay away from family gatherings. His former friends wouldn't return his calls. The only people who would speak to him were his lawyers, and even they seemed to be treating him like a liability rather than a client. He'd lost everything: his career, his reputation, his relationships, his status. All of it gone, all of it destroyed by a single confrontation at a gala, amplified by a culture that had finally decided that enough was enough. And the most devastating part for Marcus? He finally understood something that he never understood before. Power is permanent. Status is permanent. The systems that protect you can fail you. And when they do, there's nowhere left to hide. He spent his entire life in a bubble of privilege, protected by systems designed to shield men like him from accountability. And in a single night, that bubble had burst. In a single night, he learned what it felt like to be excluded, to be unwelcome, to be made to feel like you didn't belong. It was a lesson that came far too late, but it was a lesson nonetheless. Marcus Wellington sat alone in his sparsely furnished apartment, staring at the blank walls that seemed to close in on him. The once vibrant world he had inhabited felt like a distant memory. The accolades, the endorsements, the adoration of fans, all of it had been stripped away in a matter of days, leaving behind only the remnants of a life he no longer recognized. He had thought he was untouchable, that his status and wealth would shield him from any real consequences. But now, as he scrolled through social media, he saw his name trending not as a celebrated athlete, but as a pariah. Comments flooded in, each one a reminder of his downfall, each one a reflection of the pain he had caused others. Good riddance. Finally, justice. He deserved every bit of this. The words stung. He had always been able to brush off criticism, to laugh it off as the byproduct of jealousy or misunderstanding. But this was different. This was a reckoning, a collective response that left no room for denial or excuse. Marcus had spent the last few weeks in a haze of anger and disbelief, oscillating between moments of rage at Steve Harvey for exposing him and periods of deep reflection about the life he had led. He had always prided himself on being a straight shooter, someone who said what he thought without worrying about the consequences. Yet here he was, surrounded by the ruins of his own making. His phone buzzed again, another notification. This time it was from his lawyer, requesting a meeting to discuss the impending legal ramifications of his recent actions. He felt a wave of nausea. He had hoped to avoid this, to somehow make it all disappear. But the reality was undeniable. He was facing potential lawsuits from sponsors, backlash from fans, and the very real possibility of never stepping foot on a professional field again. As the days turned into weeks, Marcus found himself grappling with an uncomfortable truth. He had to confront the person he had been. He had to face the reality of his actions, not just for his own sake, but for the sake of those he had hurt. The media frenzy had begun to die down, but the damage was done. His former teammates had distanced themselves, and the few friends he had left were too embarrassed to offer support. The isolation was suffocating, forcing him to confront the emptiness of his life without the fame and fortune he had taken for granted. One evening, unable to bear the silence, he flicked on the television. The news anchor was discussing the fallout from his scandal yet again. A graphic on the screen read, "Marcus Wellington, a case study in racism and accountability." He watched as they highlighted the stories of those who had spoken out against him, each account detailing the ways he had perpetuated a culture of exclusion. Then came a segment featuring Steve Harvey, who was discussing the broader implications of accountability in sports and entertainment. "It's not enough to just apologize," Steve said earnestly. "We need to change the systems that allow this behavior to thrive. We need to create a culture where everyone feels they belong, a culture where silence is no longer an option." Marcus felt a stir of something deep within him. It was a blend of anger and admiration. Steve had turned his confrontation into a movement, and here he was, stuck in a spiral of self-pity. A part of him wanted to lash out, to blame others for his downfall. But another part he had long ignored knew that this was an opportunity for growth. Determined to make a change, Marcus sought out some of the people he had wronged. He reached out to former teammates, coaches, and even those who had spoken out publicly against him. To his surprise, many were willing to meet with him, albeit cautiously. He understood their hesitation. He had burned bridges, and rebuilding those connections would take time. His first meeting was with a former teammate, Jamal, who had been vocal about Marcus's past comments. They met at a small cafe, and Marcus felt a knot in his stomach as he approached. Jamal looked up, his expression unreadable. "Marcus," he said, his tone neutral. "What do you want?" "I came to apologize," Marcus said, feeling the weight of the words. "I know I've said and done things that hurt you and others. I've been a jerk, and I need to own that." Jamal regarded him for a long moment before speaking. "You think just saying sorry fixes everything?" "No, I know it doesn't," Marcus replied, his voice steady. "But I want to learn. I want to understand how I can do better. I want to rebuild the trust I destroyed." Jamal studied him, and Marcus felt vulnerable under his gaze. "It's going to take more than just words, you know that, right? You've got to show you mean it." "I understand," Marcus said earnestly. "I'm ready to do the work." As they spoke, Marcus found himself listening more than he had ever done in his life. Jamal shared his experiences, the pain of being marginalized, the fatigue of constantly having to prove his worth. Each story was a reminder of how naive he had been, how blind to the realities that others faced. The weeks turned into months, and Marcus continued to reach out to people he had wronged. He spoke with former colleagues, community activists, and even some of the journalists who had covered his story. Each conversation was a step toward understanding the impact of his words and actions. He also began volunteering at local youth programs, working with young athletes from diverse backgrounds. It was humbling, and at times, painful to face the reality of how he had contributed to a culture of exclusion, but he found purpose in helping others and began to rebuild his sense of self-worth, not rooted in fame or fortune, but in the positive impact he could have on the lives of others. Each interaction was a lesson. He learned about systemic racism, privilege, and the importance of allyship. He learned the value of listening, truly listening, and recognizing the power of his platform to uplift others. One day, while working with a group of young athletes, Marcus shared his own story. "I thought I was better than everyone else," he admitted, his voice trembling slightly. "I thought my talent made me special. But I've learned that true greatness isn't about being the best on the field. It's about lifting others up, recognizing our shared humanity." The response from the kids was overwhelming. They listened intently, some nodding in understanding. A few even approached him afterward, sharing their own experiences of feeling marginalized. In that moment, he realized that he was beginning to build bridges not just for himself, but for others who felt the weight of exclusion. Meanwhile, the media had moved on, but the impact of his actions lingered. The conversations around accountability in sports and entertainment continued, and Marcus found himself at the center of them, not as a villain, but as a cautionary tale and a testament to the importance of growth and redemption. One evening, while scrolling through social media, he came across a post from Steve Harvey. It read, "Accountability isn't just about punishment, it's about growth. It's about turning pain into purpose. Let's keep the conversation going." Marcus felt a surge of gratitude. He knew that Steve hadn't just confronted him, he had ignited a movement that was changing lives. And while Marcus had been forced into the spotlight for all the wrong reasons, he was determined to use this second chance to help create a better world. Months later, as he stood in front of a crowd at a youth empowerment event, Marcus felt a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He was no longer the arrogant athlete who had taken everything for granted. He was now someone committed to making a difference, someone who understood the weight of his words and actions. "Today, I stand before you not as a star athlete," he said, his voice steady, "but as someone who has learned the hard way that real success is about more than just talent. It's about integrity, responsibility, and lifting each other up." The applause that followed was genuine and heartfelt, and for the first time in a long while, Marcus felt a sense of belonging not as a celebrity, but as a human being striving to do better. He had a long way to go, and the road ahead would be filled with challenges. But he was ready. He was ready to embrace the discomfort, to continue learning, and to contribute to a culture where everyone felt they belonged. And that, he realized, was worth more than any endorsement deal or trophy. Months after the fallout, Marcus Wellington had found a new purpose. No longer the celebrated athlete, he immersed himself in community work, focusing on youth programs that promoted inclusivity and empowerment. He became a speaker at schools and community centers, sharing his journey of accountability and the importance of using one's voice for change. One day, he noticed a quiet boy named Jamal during a mentoring session. Marcus encouraged him, saying, "You can be a leader too." Their conversation highlighted Marcus' commitment to helping young athletes realize their potential. Marcus attended workshops on diversity and inclusion, learning from experts like Dr. Maya Thompson. Inspired, he organized Voices for Change, a series of community events promoting dialogue on systemic issues in sports. The first event brought together diverse speakers and fostered meaningful discussions. As Marcus shared his story, he emphasized the importance of accountability and the need to create a culture of belonging. The positive response fueled his determination to continue advocating for change. Over time, he expanded his outreach, collaborating with schools and encouraging students to challenge injustice. His message resonated, and he felt a sense of fulfillment as he helped others recognize their power to make a difference. As the year ended, Marcus reflected on his growth. He transformed his past mistakes into a catalyst for positive change. He wrote a letter to his former self, emphasizing the importance of lifting others and embracing accountability. With renewed commitment, Marcus felt ready for the challenges ahead, understanding that true change starts from within and radiates outward.